Under the flickering light of a dying street lamp, the small, forgotten town of Hollow Creek held its breath. No one dared to tread the streets after dark, not since the whispers began. The legend of the Echo Man had seeped into every corner of the town, a parasite of fear that thrived in silence. It was said he didn't walk but glided, his hollow eyes always just out of sight. You wouldn't see him. You'd hear him. The sound of your own voice, calling out to you, beckoning, repeating your words back in a tone slightly wrong. No one knew how he chose his victims, but the rules were simple. Never answer yourself, no matter what. Travis had heard the stories his whole life. His grandmother used to warn him, her voice trembling, "The Echo Man only mimics what he hears. But if you respond, he learns." The night Travis tested the legend was cold and heavy with fog. He was 19 and full of the cocky bravado that accompanies youth. A bonfire party had ended with drunken dares and morbid curiosity. His friends egged him on, and fueled by cheap beer, Travis decided to walk the wooded path to the old Miller house alone, a path infamous for its strange, repeating sounds. Halfway there, the forest grew unnaturally quiet, as if every living thing held its breath. The air thickened, the distant croak of frogs and hum of crickets abruptly snuffed out. Then from the shadows came his own voice. "Who's out there?" The words slithered back at him, the cadence a near-perfect match, but slower, wetter, as though the sound had passed through waterlogged lungs. "Funny," Travis said aloud, smirking at the trees. "You got me." "Very original." "You got me," the echo replied, distorted and lower-pitched, dripping with menace. Travis froze. His grin faltered. That wasn't right. "All right, cut it out," he said, spinning on his heel to find his prankster friends hiding behind a tree. But there was no one there. Only shadows, stretching unnaturally long in the dim light. "Cut it out," his voice mocked again. This time, the words ended in a guttural snarl that scraped the air like broken glass. The beer buzz evaporated, replaced by an icy dread crawling up his spine. He quickened his pace, the dark silhouette of the Miller house finally appearing at the edge of the woods. But the voice followed. "Travis." He whipped around. It was him. Not the echo, not distorted. His name, clear and firm, as though he'd spoken it himself. The hairs on his arms rose as his instincts screamed at him to run, but curiosity and fear rooted him to the spot. "Who's there?" His voice trembled now, the bravado long gone. "Who's there?" came the echo. But now it wasn't distant. It was close. Too close. The sound of his own voice whispered into his ear, hot breath tickling his skin. He spun, heart-hammering, but the fog only deepened, thick like a living thing, pressing against him. And then he saw it. Just ahead, something shifted. A figure, human-shaped but wrong, stood between the trees. Its movements were jittery, like a marionette in the hands of a novice puppeteer. Its face was a pale, smooth void, save for two hollow gaping holes where its eyes should have been, and its mouth was his. It opened wide, impossibly wide, and his own scream tore from its throat. Travis staggered back, heart pounding against his ribs. He turned and ran, his breath sharp and ragged as the mimicry pursued him. Each step he took, every panicked gasp he uttered, it repeated, distorted and grotesque. When the Miller house loomed ahead, Travis didn't hesitate. He barreled through the rotting door and slammed it shut behind him. The heavy silence inside was a welcome reprieve, but it was fleeting. The voice was still out there, calling. "Travis, open the door." He clenched his teeth, backing away. "You're not real," he muttered, trying to steady his shaking hands. "You're not real," it repeated, perfectly mimicking his terrified whisper. Then came the knock. Once, twice. Slow, deliberate, and the voice again, clearer now, closer. "Let me in." "No," Travis shouted, his voice breaking. He backed into a corner, his pulse thundering in his ears. "No," it whispered back. But this time, the echo came from inside the room. Travis turned, his breath caught in his throat. The thing was there, crouched in the shadows, its hollow eyes fixed on him, unblinking. Slowly, it tilted its head, its mouth stretching into an unnatural grin. The last sound Travis made was a strangled scream, swallowed whole by the thing's gaping maw. When the townsfolk found the Miller house the next day, there was no sign of him, only a smear of blood on the floorboards and a faint, eerie echo hanging in the air. They say if you walk the path at night now, you might hear Travis calling. But whatever you do, don't answer.
Story number 2.
In the outskirts of a desolate town stood a house known as the Humming Widow. No one lived there anymore, not since the family vanished decades ago, leaving the place in eerie silence, or almost silence. Visitors swore they could hear humming, a soft, melodic tune, carrying on the wind even when the windows were nailed shut and the house locked tight. Legend had it the last occupant, Eleanor Reed, had gone mad. Her husband and child had disappeared without a trace, and the grief consumed her. People claimed she hummed lullabies to an empty cradle every night until she, too, vanished, leaving the house to rot. When a group of thrill-seeking friends dared to stay the night, they thought the stories were just that, stories. The house was ancient, creaking and groaning as if it were alive, but it looked empty. Dust-coated furniture, broken windows, and a faint smell of decay greeted them. By the time the sun set, the wind howled through the cracks, creating an unsettling moan. Around midnight, they heard it, the humming, soft at first, barely audible like the whisper of a distant lullaby. Lila, the skeptic of the group, rolled her eyes. "It's probably just the wind," she said, though her voice wavered. "Wind doesn't hum," Mark whispered, his face pale. The tune grew louder, circling them, though the house was sealed. The group huddled together in the main room, their flashlights casting long shadows on the peeling wallpaper. That's when they noticed the cradle. It hadn't been there before. "Guys, this wasn't here," Emma stammered, her voice shaking as she pointed. The cradle, a rotting wooden thing, sat in the corner, rocking gently. The humming now came directly from it, louder, clearer, as though someone were standing over it. "Who's there?" Jake called out, his voice cracking. The humming stopped. The silence was worse. The group held their breath, eyes fixed on the cradle. Slowly, the air grew colder, a biting chill that sank into their bones. And then the cradle tipped, falling onto its side with a deafening crash. The sound reverberated through the room, followed by a low, guttural sob. "Let's get out of here," Lila said, already moving toward the door. But the door wouldn't budge. No matter how hard they pushed, it refused to open, as if the house itself wanted them to stay. The humming returned, now louder, coming from all directions. Shadows danced across the walls, twisting and writhing. Emma screamed, pointing at the corner where a figure began to take shape. It was a woman, her face obscured by matted hair, her hands clutching a bundle swaddled in filthy cloth. Her humming grew louder, more frantic, as though she were trying to soothe the unseen infant. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. The figure's head snapped up, and her hair parted to reveal hollow, sunken eyes that oozed darkness. Her mouth stretched unnaturally wide, and the hum turned into a wail, a deafening cry that made the walls shudder. The bundle in her arms unraveled, revealing not a baby, but a mass of writhing, insect-like creatures that spilled onto the floor. The group screamed, backing away, but the bugs swarmed toward them, chittering and hissing. "She's coming!" Emma shrieked, pointing behind them. The humming was now deafening, and Eleanor was no longer in the corner. She was right behind Jake, her bony hand outstretched, her nails blackened and jagged. The lights flickered, and in the brief flashes, her face became a skull, grinning and hollow. Jake's scream was cut short as she plunged her hand into his chest. The room erupted in chaos. One by one, the friends vanished, dragged into the shadows. Their screams echoed in the empty halls before fading into silence. By dawn, the house was quiet again, except for the faint, haunting hum that lingered in the air. To this day, no one knows what became of them, but those who pass by swear they can hear their voices mingling with the widow's song, crying for help, lost forever in her endless lullaby.
Story number 3.
In the rural town of Black Hollow, there was a road that no one dared to cross after dark. Shale Creek Road. The road itself was unremarkable, a narrow stretch cutting through thick woods, but the locals swore it was cursed. They called it the Path of Shadows, for those who walked it at night often vanished, leaving behind only whispers. Among those missing was Sarah Whitman, a high school teacher who had disappeared 10 years ago while taking the shortcut home. Her car was found abandoned on the roadside, the driver's door flung open as if she had fled in a panic. Her body was never recovered. The night Emily, a curious amateur ghost hunter, ventured onto Shale Creek Road, the moon was full but pale, casting an anemic glow over the treetops. Armed with a flashlight and a camera, she set out to document the so-called hauntings. Her friends had dared her, claiming she wouldn't last an hour. Emily, stubborn and determined, took the challenge. The road was silent save for the crunch of gravel under her boots. The woods on either side loomed like dark sentinels, their twisted branches reaching overhead. She clicked on her camera, narrating as she walked. "Shale Creek Road," she began, her voice steady, known for its legends of ghostly apparitions and disappearances, locals believe. Her words cut off abruptly as her flashlight flickered. She smacked it against her palm, cursing. The beam steadied, but the woods seemed darker now, as if the shadows had grown denser. A faint rustling caught her attention. Emily froze, swinging the flashlight toward the noise. The beam landed on a shape in the distance, a figure standing just off the road, barely visible through the trees. "Hello?" she called out, her voice breaking the oppressive silence. The figure didn't move. She squinted, trying to make out the details. It appeared to be a woman in a pale dress, her head tilted downward, long hair obscuring her face. A chill ran down Emily's spine, but she forced herself to keep filming. "Who are you?" Emily asked, her voice quivering. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she raised an arm, her hand trembling as it pointed deeper into the woods. "Nope," Emily muttered, turning back toward her car. She hadn't walked far. She could see the glint of its headlights in the distance. But as she moved, the sound of footsteps followed her. She glanced over her shoulder. The woman was gone. Emily quickened her pace, her heart hammering in her chest. The footsteps grew louder, closer, mismatched with her own. They weren't footsteps at all. They were dragging sounds, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. "Just my imagination," she whispered to herself, trying to drown out the growing panic. "It's just the stories messing with my head." But then the whispering began. It was faint at first, barely audible, like a breeze brushing through leaves. But as she walked, it grew louder, clearer. Voices overlapped, murmuring her name. "Emily, Emily." She broke into a run, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Her car was in sight now, but the whispers were relentless, swelling into a chorus of voices, each one rasping her name in tones of anger and sorrow. When she reached the car, her fingers fumbled with the keys. The whispers were inside her head now, drilling into her skull. The dragging sound was just behind her. She turned, the flashlight casting its weak glow onto the road. A figure stood there, not the woman this time, but something much worse. Its form was wrong, hunched and unnatural, its limbs elongated and thin as branches. Its head was twisted at an impossible angle, empty sockets where its eyes should have been. It opened its mouth far too wide, and the whispers turned into a scream, a high-pitched wail that shattered the silence. Emily screamed too, diving into the car and locking the doors. The creature slammed against the window, its skeletal face inches from hers, its mouth still gaping. She turned the key, the engine roaring to life. Without looking back, she sped down the road, the whispers fading behind her. Emily didn't stop until she reached her apartment, shaking and pale. She locked every door, every window, and crawled under her blankets. But when she closed her eyes, she realized the whispers hadn't stopped. That night, Emily vanished without a trace. The only clue left behind was her camera, found abandoned on Shale Creek Road. When the footage was reviewed, the final frame showed her terrified face as she turned the flashlight on something behind her, a skeletal hand reaching for her shoulder. No one walks Shale Creek Road anymore. They know better.
Story number 4.
Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, there was a trail known only by the locals as the Hollow Stairs. It wasn't marked on any map, and hikers who stumbled upon it rarely returned. Those who did came back changed, silent, haunted, unable to speak of what they'd seen. The trail was infamous, a narrow path that wound up a steep incline through dense forest, but what gave it its name was the series of perfectly carved stone steps that appeared halfway up, spiraling into the mist-shrouded trees. No one knew who had built them or why. One autumn evening, a man named Caleb ventured into the woods, ignoring the warnings of the townsfolk. He was an avid hiker and an amateur archaeologist, always chasing the next thrill. The rumors of the Hollow Stairs intrigued him. Ancient stone steps in the middle of nowhere? It had to be some kind of forgotten structure. With a map in hand and a headlamp strapped to his forehead, Caleb set off just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The trail was easy enough to find, an overgrown path cutting through the trees. The deeper he went, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, suffocating silence. After an hour of walking, he found the stairs. They were more imposing than he expected. Smooth, ancient stones, each step worn in the center as if countless feet had tread them over centuries. The stairs curved upward, disappearing into the thick fog that clung to the trees like a living thing. Caleb's curiosity overpowered his unease. He began to climb. The first few steps felt unremarkable, though the air grew colder with each step. By the 10th, he noticed something odd. The sound of his footsteps had vanished. No crunch of gravel, no scrape of boots against stone, only silence. By the 20th step, Caleb began to feel lightheaded. The air was thick, heavy, and each breath felt like inhaling smoke. He paused, turning to look back the way he'd come. But the trail was gone. Below him, the steps stretched endlessly into the mist, the ground swallowed entirely by the fog. Panic fluttered in his chest, but he pushed it down. "It's just the altitude," he muttered to himself, his voice startlingly loud in the silence. He continued upward, his headlamp casting long shadows on the stone. As he climbed, a faint sound began to emerge from the quiet, a soft, rhythmic thumping. At first he thought it might be his own heartbeat, but it was too irregular, too deliberate. It sounded like footsteps. "Hello?" he called out, his voice swallowed by the mist. The sound didn't respond. It simply continued, slow and steady, echoing faintly above him. He quickened his pace, the urge to reach the top now fueled by both fear and curiosity. The thumping grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right behind him. He spun around, shining his headlamp down the steps. There was nothing there. "Get a grip," he whispered, turning back to climb. But as he took another step, the thumping stopped, replaced by something worse. Breathing. Deep, raspy breaths coming from the fog just ahead of him. Caleb froze, his chest tightening. His headlamp flickered, casting sporadic light on the steps. For a moment he thought he saw something. A figure hunched low, crawling on all fours, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. The light flickered again, and it was gone. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but the stairs stretched endlessly in both directions. There was no down anymore, no return. The only way was forward. He took another step, and the breathing grew louder. Another step, and he heard a low, guttural growl vibrating through the stone beneath his feet. When he reached what he thought must be the final step, the fog parted just enough to reveal a clearing. In the center stood an ancient stone altar, blackened and cracked, surrounded by strange carvings that glowed faintly in the darkness. But what drew his gaze was the figure kneeling before the altar. It was humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Its back arched like a bowstring, its limbs ending in long, clawed fingers that scraped the stone. Its head turned toward Caleb, and he saw its face, or lack of one. A featureless void stared back at him, except for a mouth filled with rows of sharp, glistening teeth that stretched into a sickening grin. The thing rose, impossibly tall, its claws clicking against the stone. Caleb stumbled backward, his headlamp flickering wildly. He turned to run, but the stairs were gone. The clearing was now endless, a dark expanse with no escape. The last thing Caleb heard was a whisper, a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Welcome home." The next morning, hikers found Caleb's pack and headlamp at the base of the trail. The batteries were drained, and the map was blank, every mark erased. His body was never found, but locals say you can still hear his footsteps climbing the hollow stairs if you listen closely, always climbing, never reaching the top.
Story number 5.
In the small, forgotten town of Ravenswood, there was a peculiar rule: never leave a mirror uncovered at night. Every home had curtains or cloths to drape over reflective surfaces after sunset, and the townspeople obeyed this unspoken tradition without question. Outsiders found it strange, even laughable, but no one dared to explain why. Mara, a newcomer to Ravenswood, wasn't one for old superstitions. She'd moved there to escape the chaos of the city, renting an old Victorian house on the edge of town. It was beautiful but eerie, filled with antique furniture and heavy mirrors mounted on nearly every wall. On her first night in the house, Mara noticed the cloth coverings neatly folded on a table by each mirror. Remembering the landlord's odd warning about keeping mirrors covered after dark, she chuckled and ignored it. "I'm not afraid of my own reflection," she muttered to herself, leaving them all uncovered. The night was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes every creak and groan of the house seem deafening. Mara brushed her teeth, caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror, and climbed into bed. At 2:13 a.m., she woke suddenly. No sound had disturbed her, but an inexplicable weight pressed on her chest, a feeling of being watched. Groggy, she sat up, rubbing her eyes. The moonlight filtering through the window cast long shadows across the room. Her gaze drifted to the large mirror across from her bed. Her reflection stared back. but it wasn't right. Mara froze, her breath caught in her throat. Her reflection wasn't copying her movements. While she sat trembling on the bed, the figure in the mirror smiled, a slow, unnatural smile that stretched wider than her own face could manage. "Hello," it whispered. Mara screamed, scrambling out of bed. The sound echoed, but the reflection didn't move. Instead, it stood, its movements jerky and wrong, like a marionette with tangled strings. "You left us open," it said, its voice a rasp that scraped against her ears. "Now we're free." Panicked, Mara grabbed the blanket from her bed and flung it over the mirror. The moment the fabric touched the glass, the reflection vanished, and the oppressive weight lifted from the room. Her heart raced, and she spent the rest of the night curled in a corner, the blanket over her head. The next morning, she convinced herself it had been a nightmare, the stress of moving, an overactive imagination. She decided to cover the mirrors, just in case. But as she inspected the house, she found something disturbing. The mirrors weren't mirrors anymore. Each reflective surface now showed something else, a hallway she didn't recognize, dark and endless. The air felt heavy as she stared at them, a sense of vertigo pulling her closer. In one mirror, far down the hallway, a shadow moved. It was distant but unmistakable, a figure crawling toward her with deliberate, agonizing slowness. The knock on the door startled her out of her trance. It was her landlord, an elderly man with a grave expression. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes darting to the uncovered mirrors. "You didn't listen," he said, his voice low. "What's wrong with them?" Mara demanded, panic rising in her throat. "What's happening?" He sighed, pulling a heavy cloth from his bag. "They're doorways. At night, if you don't cover them, they open, and they come through." What are they?" Mara asked, her voice trembling. He hesitated, draping the cloth over one of the mirrors. "They're not human. They're watchers. Things that hunger for the world they've been locked out of." Mara's stomach turned as she remembered the reflection's grin. "Why didn't you warn me?" "I did," he said sharply, "and now you've let them in." That night, Mara covered every mirror in the house and locked herself in the bedroom. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the house felt like a footstep. Every shadow seemed to move. At exactly 2:13 a.m., the whispers began. "Mara," they called, soft and sing-song, coming from every direction. "Come and see." She clenched her eyes shut, clutching the blanket around her. The voices grew louder, insistent. A sharp thud came from the hallway, then another. Something heavy was walking toward her door. The doorknob rattled. Mara held her breath as the door creaked open. The cloth she'd thrown over the mirror inside the room slipped off, landing on the floor. Her reflection was there again, smiling that impossible smile. Behind it, the hallway stretched into darkness, much more, filled with shadowy figures clawing their way toward the glass. The last thing Mara saw was her reflection stepping out of the mirror, pulling her screaming into its endless depths. When the landlord returned the next day, the house was empty. Every mirror was covered except one. If you peer into it now, they say you can see Mara trapped in the hallway, her hands pressed against the glass, screaming for someone to let her out. But whatever you do, don't uncover the rest.
Story number 6.
In the quiet town of Willow Falls, there was an abandoned railway tunnel known as Dead Echo Hollow. It hadn't been used in decades, its mouth a gaping black void in the hillside, overgrown with ivy and surrounded by eerie silence. The story went that a train had derailed inside the tunnel during the early 1900s, killing everyone on board. Survivors claimed to hear the voices of their loved ones calling from the darkness, luring them inside, never to return. Over time, people stopped going near it altogether. But for Jamie and his friends, the legend was nothing more than an opportunity for a thrill. The group of 4 teens, Jamie, Marcus, Leah, and Claire, decided to explore the tunnel on Halloween night, armed with flashlights, phones, and bravado. The air was thick with mist, and the trees whispered as the wind passed through their branches. "This is so dumb," Claire muttered as they stood at the mouth of the tunnel. Her flashlight trembled in her hand. "Come on, it's just a tunnel," Marcus said, grinning. "Ghosts aren't real." Leah stepped forward, her phone's camera rolling. "Urban legend, debunked," she said dramatically. "Let's see what's really in here." The tunnel swallowed their voices as they entered, the faint light from their flashlights barely illuminating the graffiti-covered walls. The air was cold, damp, and heavy, carrying a faint metallic scent that made Jamie's stomach turn. The farther they went, the darker it became, the tunnel seeming to stretch endlessly before them. "Does it feel longer to anyone else?" Leah asked, her voice echoing. "It's an illusion," Marcus said confidently, though his steps slowed. "Tunnels do that." But Jamie wasn't so sure. He swore they'd been walking for miles, yet the entrance was long out of sight, and the end of the tunnel remained shrouded in blackness. His flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw a shadow dart across the beam. "Did you see that?" Jamie asked, his voice shaking. "See what?" Claire snapped, her nerves frayed. "You're just freaking yourself out." And then they heard it, a faint voice echoing through the tunnel. "Help. Me." They froze, the sound bouncing off the walls, distant but unmistakable. It was the voice of a child, weak and trembling. "We have to check it out," Marcus said, his bravado fading into concern. "Are you insane?" Claire hissed. Then asked, "It's a trap." "Trap or not, what if someone's really hurt?" Jamie said, moving forward despite the icy fear creeping up his spine. The others reluctantly followed, their flashlights flickering more frequently. The voice grew louder, clearer. "Help me, please." When they rounded a corner, the beam of Jamie's flashlight landed on something that made his blood run cold. It was a boy, no older than 10, sitting on the tracks. His clothes were torn and his face was pale, almost translucent. "Hey!" Jamie called out, his voice shaking. "Are you okay?" The boy turned his head slowly, too slowly, and Jamie's stomach churned at the sight of his empty eyes. Just dark, hollow sockets staring back. "Run," the boy whispered, his mouth twisting into a grotesque grin. "It's coming." The lights on their flashlights died all at once, plunging them into complete darkness. Claire screamed, and Jamie grabbed her arm, pulling her backward. But the tunnel wasn't empty anymore. A low, guttural growl echoed around them, followed by the deafening sound of metal screeching against metal. A light flickered in the distance, two beams like the eyes of a train barreling toward them. The rumbling grew louder, the ground shaking beneath their feet. Jamie's heart raced as he shouted, "Move! Get off the tracks!" But when they scrambled to the sides of the tunnel, there was nowhere to go. The walls were slick and sheer, the space too narrow to escape. The sound of the phantom train was deafening now, drowning out their screams. The light engulfed them, blinding and hot. And then, silence. When Jamie opened his eyes, he was lying on the tracks alone. His friends were gone. The tunnel was quiet again, the oppressive darkness pressing against him like a weight. "Marcus? Leah? Claire?" he called out, his voice trembling. Only his echo answered. He stumbled toward the entrance, or at least where he thought the entrance should be. But no matter how far he walked, the tunnel stretched endlessly, and then he heard it, his friends' voices calling out to him. "Jamie, help us." He froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The voices weren't right. They overlapped, distorted, and carried a strange, metallic echo. Jamie turned to run, but the tunnel had other plans. The light appeared again, and this time there was no escaping it. The last thing he saw was the train, its twisted metal frame screeching toward him, faces pressed against its shattered windows. His friends, their mouths open in silent screams. The next morning, the police found Jamie's backpack and a single flashlight at the entrance of the tunnel. No bodies were ever recovered, and the townsfolk added 4 more names to the list of those claimed by Dead Echo Hollow. But on quiet nights, if you stand near the tunnel, you can hear them, faint whispers and pleas for help, trapped forever in the darkness.
Story number 7.
In the heart of an old industrial district, there was a derelict building known as the Silo. It had once been part of a bustling factory, its towering structure looming over the surrounding warehouses. But decades of abandonment had left it crumbling, its concrete walls streaked with rust and graffiti. Locals avoided it, claiming it was haunted. Some said you could hear voices echoing inside. Others swore they'd seen shadows moving in the broken windows. For Chris and his best friend Mia, the Silo was the ultimate dare. It was Halloween, and their friends had bet them $50 each to spend the night inside. Armed with flashlights and a sense of adventure, they climbed through a gap in the rusted fence and made their way to the entrance. The air inside was cold and damp, carrying the faint smell of mildew and oil. Their footsteps echoed loudly on the cracked concrete floor as they explored the main chamber, a vast, hollow space with debris scattered everywhere. "This place is creepy as hell," Mia muttered, shining her flashlight toward the far wall where a faded sign read, "Authorized personnel only." Chris laughed nervously. It's just an old factory. Nothing to be scared of. But as they ventured deeper, the atmosphere grew heavier. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of metal and the distant sound of dripping water. They found a stairwell leading up to the higher levels of the silo. "Let's see what's up there," Chris said, trying to mask his unease. Mia hesitated but followed. The stairs groaned under their weight, and the walls seemed to close in the higher they climbed. When they reached the top, they found themselves in a narrow corridor lined with rusted doors, most of them sealed shut. Only one stood slightly ajar. A faint sound came from inside, a rhythmic tapping like metal against metal. "Did you hear that?" Mia whispered, clutching Chris's arm. "Probably just the wind," Chris said, though his voice wavered. They stepped into the room, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The space was small and cluttered with old machinery and tools. In the corner stood a single chair facing the wall. It was tilted slightly, as if someone had been sitting in it and stood abruptly. "Okay, let's go," Mia said, backing toward the door. But before they could leave, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. And then the chair moved. It didn't tip or fall. It slid several inches across the floor as if something invisible had pushed it. Mia screamed, and Chris grabbed her hand, pulling her out of the room. As they ran down the corridor, the air seemed to thicken, making it harder to breathe. Their flashlights flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced along the walls. They reached the stairwell, but the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, though no one else was there. Chris didn't dare look back as they sprinted down the stairs. When they reached the main chamber, the footsteps stopped, but the atmosphere remained suffocating. They bolted for the entrance, but as they approached, a loud metallic clang echoed through the space. The door they'd entered through was now sealed shut. "What the hell?" Chris yelled, tugging at the rusted metal. It wouldn't budge. A low, guttural voice echoed through the chamber, reverberating off the walls. "You shouldn't have come here." Mia turned, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The beam landed on a figure at the far end of the room. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and its mouth curved into a grotesque smile, revealing jagged yellow teeth. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. Chris and Mia backed away, their hearts pounding as the creature raised one bony hand, pointing at them. "You're staying," it rasped, its voice a chilling mix of a growl and a whisper. Desperate, Chris swung his flashlight at the creature, but the beam passed through it as if it were smoke. Mia grabbed a rusted pipe from the floor, hurling it toward the thing, but it clattered harmlessly to the ground. The creature laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that made their skin crawl. The shadows in the room deepened, swirling around the figure like a living thing. Suddenly, the room shifted. The walls seemed to close in, the air grew colder, and the faint sound of whispers surrounded them, dozens of voices overlapping, growing louder and louder. "Run!" Mia screamed, though there was nowhere to go. The creature lunged, and everything went dark. When the search party found Chris and Mia the next morning, they were huddled together in a corner of the silo, their faces pale and their eyes vacant. Neither spoke a word about what had happened, but they were never the same again. The silo remains abandoned, but locals say if you stand outside on a quiet night, you can hear the tapping sound echoing from within, followed by faint whispers and a raspy laugh. No one dares to go inside anymore.
Story number 8.
There was a cabin deep in the forest known as the Watcher's Refuge. For decades, it had stood untouched, nestled between ancient pines. The locals avoided it, warning hikers to stay far away. "The forest watches from there," they'd say in hushed tones, refusing to explain further. Despite the warnings, a group of friends, Rachel, Sam, Peter, and Eva, rented the cabin for a weekend getaway. They were all seasoned campers, drawn to the remote location by promises of solitude and adventure. The cabin was charming in its own way, though weathered and creaking, with a large stone fireplace and windows that seemed to peer into the soul of the forest. Their first day was uneventful, filled with hiking and laughter. But as night fell, a strange unease settled over the group. It wasn't the isolation. Something felt off. The forest, so lively during the day, had fallen into an unnatural silence. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness. "I don't like this," Eva murmured as they gathered around the fireplace. "It's too quiet. Probably just your imagination." Peter said, trying to sound confident, though his eyes flicked toward the windows. We're in the middle of nowhere. What's out there to be afraid of? Rachel glanced out the window, shivering. It's not what's out there, she said softly. It feels like something's watching. They laughed nervously, brushing off the tension, but none of them could shake the feeling. That night, they each lay awake in their bunks, listening to the silence, their breaths shallow. At 3 a.m., Rachel woke with a start. A faint sound drifted through the cabin, a soft, rhythmic tapping. She sat up, her heart pounding as she strained to hear. The sound came again, louder this time, as if someone or something was knocking on the cabin's wooden walls. She crept to the window, peering out into the dark. The moonlight cast eerie shadows across the trees, but there was nothing there. Yet the tapping continued, now moving along the walls, circling the cabin. "Sam," she hissed, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" Sam groaned, but sat up, rubbing his eyes. As the tapping grew louder, his expression darkened. "What the hell is that?" The others stirred, one by one, their faces pale as they listened. The tapping stopped suddenly, leaving only the suffocating silence. Then came the whisper, "Come outside." It was faint, barely audible, but it sent chills down their spines. The voice was raspy, inhuman, and seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Did you hear that?" Eva whimpered, clutching Peter's arm. Before anyone could answer, the cabin door rattled as though someone was trying to open it. Sam grabbed a flashlight, his hands shaking. "Stay here," he said, heading toward the door. "Don't." Rachel pleaded, but he was already opening it. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing only the empty clearing outside. Sam stepped onto the porch, his breath visible in the cold night air. "There's nothing here," he called back, but his voice wavered. As he turned to go back inside, the flashlight flickered and died. A shadow moved at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the moonlight. It was tall and hunched, with long, twisted limbs and glowing eyes that pierced the darkness. "Sam, get inside!" Rachel screamed. But it was too late. The shadow lunged, its movements unnaturally fast and jerky. Sam's scream was cut short as the door slammed shut behind him. The others bolted the door and pressed their backs against it, their hearts racing. Outside, there was no sound, no struggle, no footsteps, just silence. And then the tapping resumed, louder than before, coming from every wall at once. "Let me in." Sam's voice pleaded from the other side of the door. But something was wrong. The voice was distorted, stretched, and hollow. "That's not Sam," Peter whispered, his face pale. The tapping grew frantic, joined by scratching and pounding. The cabin trembled as if the forest itself was closing in on them. The whispers returned, now a chorus of voices. "Let us in. Come outside. We see you." Suddenly the fireplace roared to life, the flames unnaturally high and blue. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and writhing into grotesque shapes. Eva screamed, backing away as one of the shadows seemed to reach for her, its claw-like hand stretching toward the floor. Rachel grabbed her flashlight and aimed it at the window. For a brief moment, the beam illuminated the figure outside, a grotesque skeletal creature with empty sockets where eyes should have been, its mouth twisted into a chilling grin. It pressed its face to the glass, its breath fogging the window as it whispered, "We've been waiting." The light flickered again, and the figure vanished. But the pounding on the walls grew deafening, the whispers now a cacophony of screams. One by one, the lights in the cabin went out, plunging them into darkness. The last thing Rachel saw was the door bursting open and the shadows pouring inside like a living tide. The next morning, hikers found the cabin empty. The furniture was overturned and claw marks scarred the walls. The only sign of the group was a single flashlight lying on the porch, its beam still faintly flickering. Locals say the Watcher's Refuge is cursed, a place where the forest itself comes alive. Some claim to hear whispers when passing by. Others see shadowy figures lurking in the windows. But no one dares stay the night anymore. The forest is always watching.
Story number 9.
On the outskirts of a small, windswept town, there stood a decrepit house known as the Wailing Hollow. For as long as anyone could remember, it had been a place of dread. Every so often, someone would claim to hear a woman's cries echoing from the boarded-up windows, though no one had lived there for decades. They said the house had a history. A mother had gone mad there, taking her own life after her child mysteriously disappeared. Some whispered that her grief had cursed the house, trapping her spirit and anyone foolish enough to enter. Skeptical of the tales, Jake, Sarah, and their younger cousin Ben decided to investigate. They were visiting the town for the weekend, bored and eager for something to pass the time. The idea of a haunted house was too tempting to resist. It was just after dusk when they arrived at the Wailing Hollow, armed with flashlights and a crowbar to pry open the nailed-shut door. The air around the house was unnaturally still, the trees on the property gnarled and bare despite the season. "This place is falling apart," Jake said, laughing nervously as he forced the door open with a loud crack. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the faint smell of rot lingering in the shadows. Cobwebs clung to the corners and the wooden floors creaked beneath their feet. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, its floral patterns barely visible through layers of grime. "See, just an old house," Sarah said, her voice echoing. "Nothing to be scared of." Ben wasn't so sure. He had felt a heaviness the moment they stepped inside, a sense of being watched. He stuck close to Jake, gripping his flashlight tightly. They explored the first floor, finding little more than broken furniture and debris. But when they reached the staircase, Ben stopped abruptly. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Jake and Sarah paused, straining to listen. At first, there was only silence, but then it came, a faint, distant sound like someone softly sobbing. It echoed from somewhere above. "Probably just the wind," Jake said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I don't think we should go up there," Ben said, backing away. "Come on," Sarah said, rolling her eyes. "It's probably just an animal or something. Let's check it out." Reluctantly, Ben followed as they ascended the stairs. Each step groaned under their weight, the sound blending with the faint sobbing that grew louder with every step. When they reached the top, the noise stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence. The hallway was long and narrow, lined with doors that seemed to lean inward, as though the house itself were caving in. One door at the far end was slightly ajar, and the others were firmly shut. "Let's start with that one," Sarah said, pointing to the open door. Inside was a nursery. The walls were painted a faded yellow, peeling in places, and the furniture, a crib, a rocking chair, a small dresser, was coated in dust. A single wooden mobile dangled above the crib, its carved animals motionless. "This is unsettling," Jake admitted, shining his flashlight around. Then the mobile began to spin, slowly at first, then faster, as though an unseen hand had pushed it. Sarah stepped closer to the crib, her curiosity overriding her fear. "Look, there's something in." Before she could finish, the rocking chair moved. It tipped back and forth, its creaking breaking the oppressive silence. The sobbing returned, louder now, coming from all directions. "Okay, that's enough," Jake said, grabbing Sarah's arm. "We're leaving." But when they turned to leave the nursery, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Ben screamed, fumbling with the flashlight as the room plunged into darkness. "Open it," Sarah yelled, pounding on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The sobbing turned into wails, high-pitched, agonizing screams that seemed to seep into their bones. The rocking chair was now violently rocking, slamming against the floor as if something invisible were sitting in it. "She's coming," Ben whimpered, tears streaming down his face. "Who's coming?" Jake demanded, trying to force the door open. Before Ben could answer, a shadowy figure appeared in the corner of the room. It was a woman, her form flickering like a dying flame. Her head hung at an unnatural angle, her hair obscuring her face. She raised a hand, pointing directly at Sarah. "Why did you take him?" the figure shrieked, her voice echoing like shattered glass. "We didn't," Sarah screamed, backing into the crib. The woman's head snapped upward, revealing hollow eyes and a gaping mouth. She let out a piercing scream that made the walls tremble. The mobile spun wildly above the crib, the carved animals flying off one by one as if flung by invisible hands. Suddenly, the door burst open, and they bolted down the hallway. The sobbing and screams chased them, the walls seeming to close in as they stumbled down the stairs. When they reached the front door, they found it wide open, though they were certain they had left it shut. They ran until they were far from the house, collapsing in a heap on the roadside. None of them spoke as they caught their breath, the terror still fresh in their minds. The next morning, they returned with the town sheriff, determined to explain what had happened. But when they arrived, the Wailing Hollow was gone. In its place was a field of overgrown grass, as though the house had never existed. Locals still claim to hear crying from that spot on quiet nights, and some even see the flicker of a rocking chair moving in the darkness, but no one dares approach. The Wailing Hollow doesn't need walls to trap its victims. It waits, and it remembers.